Welcome back to Design 1. Today we're talking about proportion. This is an image of the Parthenon in Athens, Greece. And if we take what's left of the predella, where the roof line used to be, and extend those lines out, we'll get a complete picture of the overall shape of what this structure once was. This will help us find the overall proportion of the building. This building exists in a proportion of 1 to 1.618. This is called the golden ratio, or the golden section. Proportion is ratio. It is the comparison of size, measures, or magnitude of this to that. In this case, the height of our format is a ratio of 1 to the length or width being a ratio of 1.618. The reason for the importance of this ratio will become clear as we move along, but I'm going to do a couple of things with this diagram of the Parthenon that we have right now. I'm going to break the format here. This division creates a proportional break in our picture plane. The square exists in a ratio of 1 to the overall size of our picture plane being 1.618. Likewise, the smaller rectangle to the right of the square exists in a ratio of 1 to the square being 1.618. The special thing about the golden mean is that as it breaks down and subsequently smaller parts according to proportion, each smaller section retains the same proportional relationship as the two previous larger sections. Next, I'm going to find the diagonal of our picture plane, that line that moves from one corner to the opposing corner. And you'll see that it intersects the line of the square break at an interesting point. This is where the top of the colonnade lies. Contain power in terms of position inside the picture plane. I'll next find the transverse of the diagonal. The transverse lies at a right angle to the overall diagonal. And you can see that when you find the transverse of the diagonal, it hits the top of the rectangle precisely at the location where the square break exists. This is how you break down any rectangle to find its proportional relationship. Use the diagonal and find the transverse. The point at which the transverse intercepts the original picture plane is where your proportional break exists. Now, if I see where that proportional break, the line where the square break is, intercepts the original diagonal, I'll have my secondary proportional break, where this line intersects the transverse. I can create another line, and so on, into infinity, well, depending on how small or large your image is and how thin your pen is. These divisions of the picture plane into proportionally smaller and smaller parts represents a harmony of proportion that we've been attuned to through nature to appreciate. Artists have taken this rectangle and used it throughout art history in many different ways, from, as we saw, in ancient Greece, through ancient Egypt, and into the present day. This proportion of 1 in terms of height to 1.618 in terms of length is carried out throughout the picture plane every time a new division is created. So that on the top, where we have the line that creates the square break, you have a proportion of 1 to 1.618. As well as on the side, you have this proportion of 1 to 1.618. The proportion carries through each subsequent smaller break. This is true also not only in terms of the length of the lines, but the size of the area of each shape that's created as you break down the picture plane. So that the rectangle on the right contains an area of 1 to the area of the square on the left being 1.618. So to here, the smaller of the two shapes containing an area of 1 to the larger 1.618, and so on, and again so on until we come back to our fully broken down golden mean rectangle. Why is this ratio so important? These seemingly random numbers of 1.618 to 1. The reason that these ratios are so pleasing is because it's all around us. It's found in nature. Here in the nautilus shell, it's found in the ways that leaves grow out of tree branches. A 13th century mathematician in Italy named Fibonacci, or Leonardo Pisano, studied the rate of propagation of a pair of rabbits, and he came up with a sequence of numbers that is as follows: 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, 144, 233, and so on. This rate of progression is found by adding the previous two numbers in the sequence to get the following number. So that 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8, 8 plus 5 is 13, and so on. This rate of increase averages out at a mean proportion of 1 to 1.618. It is found, this proportion, in our anatomy and the relationship here, for example, between the length of your forearm and the length of your hand. And it's called many different things, including the golden mean, the golden section, divine proportion, the precious jewel, phi, or we might refer to it as 5 by 8. You have to remember that this proportion is an average. So not everyone's arm is going to break down perfectly into a ratio of 1 to 1.618. But on average, this is how these things work in nature. The Parthenon, which was the house of the goddess Athena, Parthenos, was designed in relation to our own proportions. It's meant to house not only the gods, but us. A lot of ancient architecture would follow this principle, using the proportions of the human body to create a home that we would feel comfortable in. This ratio has a long history, and I can understand one's hesitancy to buy into this game of proportions as being a real means of visual communication. But my aim during this lecture is to show you how important it is. To do that, we have to figure out first how to actually create a golden mean rectangle. This is a diagram from Maitland Graves's The Art of Color and Design. You find a golden mean rectangle by first creating a square. You find the midpoint of one side of that square, CB, the midpoint being M on this diagram. and find the length of the diagonal from that midpoint to the opposing corner, A. That length of MA is then dropped down to be parallel with your original line CB. And that will give you the length of the rectangle. I'm going to go over this again because I know it's confusing. I'm going to start with a square. On the bottom line of my square, I'm going to find a midpoint. From that midpoint, I'm going to find the length of the diagonal from the midpoint to the top right corner. I'm going to drop this length down, meaning that I'm not going to alter the length of it in any way. I'm going to take a precise measurement and I'm going to move it down, making sure that it stays connected to the midpoint. When I lay this length down, I now have the actual length of what my rectangle should be. This is how you create a golden mean rectangle of any size. This shape is pleasing in its proportions. And this has been studied actually psychologically through tests. Participants come back to this shape over and over again to select it as a pleasing rectangle. I'm going to take this rectangle and I'm going to turn it vertically. And I'm going to find the length of its longest size. And I'm going to drop that length down from the corner until it meets the opposing line. And then I'm going to repeat that diagonal line on the other side. This triangle on the left has a proportion of 1 at the base. The length of the hypotenuse is 1.618, which means that the height of the triangle is the square root of 1.618. I'm simply doubling it, mirroring it on itself here to create this shape, which is not very far off at all from the Great Pyramids at Giza. Now, this photograph is taken from the ground, obviously, which is going to play with our perspective on it. So the pyramid, in this photograph at least, won't appear to line up perfectly. And the pyramids aren't precisely this proportional relationship, but they're very close. There's a lot of other ancient Egyptian art that follows this proportional system as well. So again, this is something that's been used for thousands upon thousands of years, this proportional relationship of 1 to 1.618. But let's go back to our golden mean rectangle for a second and find perhaps an easier to understand relationship. Through this is the golden altarpiece in the Basilica of San Marco in Venice. And here, Maitland Graves has laid out the proportional divisions on the surface of the altarpiece. And you can see that the top predella exists in a ratio of 1 to the bottom portion being 1.618. The height of the overall altarpiece is 1 to the length of 1.618. And again, I feel I need to emphasize here that these ratios, 1 to 1.618, isn't the length. It's not 1 foot to 1.618 feet. It's the unit, whatever unit it is, however high it is the ratio of one to the other that creates this unit of 1 to 1.618. Or here's a painting by George Seurat, the Parade du Cercle from 1887. And if I overlay this golden mean rectangle on top of it, I can see that he's using these proportions to break up the picture plane. Now his painting is larger, it's taller than our golden mean rectangle here. Most art that you'll find doesn't exist solely within this proportional scheme. It's usually off that proportion a little bit, but they'll still use the proportional breaks within the larger format that they're using. So here, Seurat has the line of lights along the top of the composition, which creates a break. And below that, the rest of the image does exist in a ratio of 1 to 1.618. And you can see more clearly what I'm talking about here. The size of the canvas shown is 39.25 inches by 59 inches. And you can see that the few inches at the top, where all of the lights are, that creates that section break for us. If we subtract that from the height of 39.25, we might get somewhere around, say, 37. So then around 37 by 59 is going to give you the proportion of 1 to 1.618. The artist is going to use these proportional breaks in different ways. The main one that we can see, the first largest break of this square on the left side, you can see is where he has given us a fairly strong division. You can see that in the actual work of art, the surface divisions of the painting that the artist gives us won't always necessarily correspond directly with the proportional breaks of the grid that we're overlaying on top of it. But they do come very close. This is an important distinction to recognize because these proportional rules that we're talking about and the way that the picture is broken down into smaller and smaller parts isn't something that the artist necessarily sets out to use in any specific way. These format breaks, the divisions on the picture plane, are sometimes possibly found through intuition, a developed and learned and studied intuition. Sometimes the artist is very keen on using math, this geometry, very specifically to employ in their picture. But that's not always the case. We can flip this grid around if we want, and we can see how he's using it in the bottom left corner to find the divisions of the picture there. Or we can even use it hanging from the top, and we find that the eyes and noses of the spectators at the bottom help to create the same kind of division that the line of lights do along the top of the painting. And we can see how the proportional breaks are being used to find the location of the boy in the bottom right corner of the picture plane. It's also interesting how the spectators in the bottom right corner are placed along the curve of the spiral. Here are illustrations provided by Maitland Graves that show the ways that the area of a picture plane can be broken up into pleasing golden mean sections without actually following along the lines of those proportional section breaks. The dotted lines represent where those section breaks exist along that grid, but the image that you're making might not fall exactly along those lines. The area of different shapes on the picture plane, though, can still correspond in relation of 1 to 1.618 without falling along those division lines. Along the bottom, you can see different ways that the picture plane can be broken up along these division breaks as well. And here's where the whole design bit really comes into focus, I think. I think it's pretty easy to take the jump here from these sort of divisions of the picture plane to something like an ad in a magazine or the layout of the page of a book. These principles that we're talking about don't apply strictly to fine arts. It's important in graphic design as well. Here in diagram 6 from Maitland Graves, we can see how the use of ratios and proportions allows for a contrast in size and shape that's still related to each other and to the original surface, which creates a unity while it creates contrast at the same time. Shapes A and D on this picture plane are the same shape, but they contain a contrast of size. Shapes F and B, on the other hand, are different shapes, but they contain the same area, the same size area. So that each of these shapes are both related to each other and contrasting with each other at the same time. And this is what we want. This is how contrast really works. Contrast is meaningless without unity. Here, I'll lay that diagonal again from E to C on this rectangle. And you can see that the shapes A and D, that the corners of shapes A and D directly correspond to the diagonal. This is an easy way to create shapes within your picture plane that share the same shape as the picture plane, but alternate in size. It's to create the rectangles using the diagonal. Here's another example of that from Graves. You can see the way that the diagonal of the picture plane is being used to help create smaller and smaller shapes within the picture plane. These then contain a unity of shape, but a contrast in size. The use of the diagonal doesn't mean that you're restricted to placing all of your shapes along the diagonal. You can find the diagonal and then find a line parallel to the diagonal to help create a smaller shape as well. And here the use of both the diagonal and the transverse of the diagonal, that line that intersects the diagonal at a right angle, is being used to create smaller shapes within the picture plane that share a unity of shape with the picture plane itself while containing a contrast in size. And so here we're starting to use different proportions for our format. Here's an example of that from a work of art. This is a portrait by Edgar Degas. And first we'll find the diagonal of the whole, and then we'll find smaller rectangles within the picture plane using the diagonal to create these shapes. You can see that their corners all lie along the diagonal of the picture plane. There's a modulation of size from the size of the overall canvas to smaller and smaller subsections of the painting itself. This is the hidden geometry of the picture plane at use. And here you'll notice that we've moved away from the golden mean rectangle. So let's try to find some other sorts of rectangles that might be useful for us. There is the root 5 rectangle, in which two phi rectangles, remember that phi represents that 1.618 ratio. So two golden mean rectangles overlapping on the square. I'll start with my square and find the line from the midpoint to the upper corner and drop that line down again, which helps me create my first golden mean rectangle. I'll repeat this process on the other side so that I have two golden mean rectangles that overlap each other along the square break. This proportion of the root 5 rectangle is 1 to 2.236. It's called the root 5 rectangle because the square root of 5 is 2.236. This is a rectangle that makes use of the golden mean, but isn't itself a golden mean rectangle. And people like Leonardo da Vinci like to use it. Here's his painting, The Annunciation, from 1472. This highlighted section in yellow on the right creates an area of 1 when compared to the rest of the composition, which contains an area of 1.618. So even in this root 5 rectangle, Da Vinci is making use of golden mean proportions. Here we can see the division of 1 to 1.618. He's doing the same thing with the top section of the painting in comparison to the bottom section of the painting, maintaining that proportion of 1 to 1.618. This divine proportion, which is relevant in regards to the subject matter. But the root 5 rectangle is not the only so-called root rectangle. There's a whole series of these, and this is how you find them. There's the root 1 rectangle. Easy enough, the square root of 1 is 1. It's a square. I'm going to find the overall diagonal of this. Now you see here that we're shifting. We're not taking the diagonal from the midpoint to the upper corner, but rather the diagonal of the whole. And I'm going to drop that diagonal down to create a root 2 rectangle. This is sometimes called a 5 by 7. It contains a ratio of 1 to 1.4. The root 2 rectangle here, if I take and turn it vertically and find the diagonal, and the diagonal is transverse, you'll see that this rectangle breaks down into halves. Each subsequent proportional break in the 5 by 7 rectangle cuts the previous shape made in half, which is a peculiar relationship that the 5 by 7 has on its own. Here's a painting by Caravaggio called Judith Beheading Holofernes. And you'll see that, like the Seurat painting, this one is a little bit taller than the 5 by 7 rectangle that we're using here, or the root 2 rectangle that we're using here. In the same way that the Seurat painting was a little bit taller than the 5 by 8 rectangle. Nonetheless, the artist is still using this root 2 rectangle found within his format to help arrange the picture. I'm going to find the overall diagonal of the 5 by 7 rectangle, and then I'm going to find the transverses from both corners. You'll see that the transverse on the left helps us to find the thrust of Holofernes' shoulder, and that the overall diagonal crosses both Holofernes' eyes and Judith's eyes, so that there is a strong implied line between these two characters. If I use our diagonals and transverses to help me find the proportional breakdown of this rectangle, this helps me see the way that Caravaggio has arranged different sizes within the picture plane. For instance, here, the size of this shape, which is created by the light cast on Judith, is a repetition of the size of the proportional break in the top right corner. This shape here, created by the right angle of Holofernes' bent arm, is the next smallest proportional size. These two heads are the next smallest proportional size, and this is the next smallest proportional size. So here Caravaggio is using a system of relations of sizes of objects to the overall picture plane in proportion to the picture plane that helps to create a contrast of size that is also proportionally relational to the size of the picture plane. Unity and contrast are created at once. If I take that root 2 rectangle and find the diagonal and drop that diagonal down, then I'll have a root 3 rectangle, which creates a proportional relationship of 1 to 1.717. In each of these root rectangles, when you find the diagonal and the transverse of that diagonal, as we've already established, the place where that transverse intercepts the line of the original format, that is where you'll find the proportional break. It just so happens that in the case of the root rectangles, that those proportional breaks end up creating equal parts, so that when you break down the root 3 rectangle using the diagonal and the transverse of the diagonal, you end up with 3 smaller root 3 rectangles inside your original format. So if I take that diagonal of the root 3 and drop it down, I'll of course have the root 4 rectangle. But the square root of 4 is 2, so this is a proportion of 1 to 2. This is called a tatami, or the double square. And here's that example again of finding the diagonal and the transverse of that diagonal, and how that breaks down the picture plane into 4 smaller tatamis within the larger tatami. This proportion of 1 to 2, the tatami, is used extensively in Japanese culture, specifically in the tea ceremony. The mat is called a tatami and exists in a relationship of 1 to 2. And the mats, as they're laid out in the room where the tea ceremony takes place, are always arranged in accordance to this proportional system. If I again take the diagonal of that root 4 and drop it down, then I'll have created my root 5 rectangle, which exists in a proportion of 1 to 2.236. But we've seen the root 5 rectangle before. It is this rectangle that we've already looked at, which is actually 2 golden mean rectangles superimposed on each other, intersecting at the square break. So even using this root method to create the rectangles, we find our way back again to the golden mean. The golden mean can be used in different ways as well. Here I have a vertical golden mean rectangle, and it is broken into the proportion of 1 to 1.618 vertically. If I overlap on top of that another golden mean rectangle, which intersects on that proportion break as well, then I'll have a rectangle with a proportion of 1 to 1.71. We might find this proportional rectangle somewhere like the Sistine Chapel. Here is Michelangelo's The Last Judgment, and you'll see that from the top of this wall painting down to where the altar lies creates a proportion of 1 to 1.71. There are many and really varied ways of using this golden mean rectangle and its subsequent proportional breaks in very meaningful ways. And all of this can start to feel quite overwhelming. But in this class, at least, we're only going to be dealing with a few rectangles. One you've already dealt with, the square. We'll also be using the root 2 rectangle, or the 5 by 7, or the 1 to 1.4 rectangle. The golden mean rectangle, or phi, or the 5 by 8, or 1 to 1.618 rectangle. And the tatami, the double square, the 1 to 2 rectangle. These are the 4 rectangles, the 4 formats that we'll be using for the rest of the semester. So it's not important so much for you to be so concerned with these other rectangles that I've talked about, but more to understand the way that these things are related to each other and how to create them. For your homework, you'll be using the root 2 rectangle, so let's go over how to create that again. I have a square, the root 1, and I'll take the diagonal of that square And that measurement I'll drop down precisely along the bottom line of the square. And where that extends to, I'll have created the root 2 rectangle. So let's go over one more time how proportions are used to break down an image and to help in the design. Here's another painting by Caravaggio, The Entombment of Christ. This red rectangle that I have outlined here represents a golden mean rectangle. And once again, you see that the artist is using a format that is actually larger than the proportional rectangle that we're using to study it. The formats that they're using, the canvases and other surfaces that they're using, were oftentimes predetermined for them. Paintings like this were going in churches, and the churches had an area that needed to be filled by the canvas. And so the size, the overall proportion of that canvas, this one being 120 inches by 80 inches, was predetermined for the artist. You might recognize that the ratio of 120 inches to 80 inches is a ratio of 2 to 3. So we could examine this painting in terms of how he's breaking it down, and relationships are in proportions of 2 to 3. But Caravaggio here is using very specifically divine proportion, the golden mean, to create a more dynamic image within his rectangle. We'll find the overall diagonal of the golden mean rectangle. You can see already that there are a few elements that lie along this diagonal. In the bottom left corner, the shawl that is covering Christ's body rests on the diagonal, as does his hand. And moving up from there, you can see that his thigh is directly parallel with this diagonal movement, which moves up and through the eyes and hand of the grieving person in the back. I'm then going to find the transverse of that diagonal, which again, Caravaggio is using in a very dynamic way. This captures the leaning head of the mourner behind the man carrying Christ. It is also the diagonal of the mourner behind her. From that section where the transverse intercepts the edge of the picture plane, we'll create our first proportional division here. This proportional break creates a square in the bottom. It also provides the place of rest along which the heads of the two men carrying Christ rest. The intersection of the diagonal and this first proportional break is where the man in orange's elbow bends as well. These are powerful positional moments in the picture plane. These are the perceptual forces that we talked about from the very beginning of class. Where you place items, elements in your picture plane is going to be more or less powerful if they're placed in relation to the underlying geometry of the picture plane itself. Where that proportional break intercepts the diagonal line, we'll find our second proportional break. And where that proportional break intercepts the transverse, we'll find our third. And where that proportional break intercepts the diagonal, we'll find our fourth, and so on, smaller and smaller. I'm going to overlay this spiral, the spiral of the golden mean here. And we can see that this spiral captures the downward movement of the hands of the mourner on the back to the hand that rests along the first proportional break to the brow of Christ and down. Now I have a good idea of the size relationships that exist within this image. So I'm going to see how Caravaggio is using these different proportional sizes at different locations within the picture plane. Here, the size of the second proportional break gives us the overall size of Christ's body. And here, the proportional size smaller than that gives us both the overall size of the man in orange carrying Christ, as well as the division of Christ's body where the man's hand supports his torso underneath him. The next smaller proportional size we might find in the shape that's created by the hand of Christ that lies along the diagonal of the picture plane. And the next smaller size we might find in the head shapes of the mourners, Christ himself, and the man carrying him. That next smallest shape might be made up of another face and the three hands extended out in mourning. This is the hidden structure of the picture plane. And though this is not what we see, it's what our mind understands intuitively when it does see this. The idea of proportion and shapes moving in proportion smaller and smaller, that all of this is related back to the overall size of the picture plane. It's a very difficult idea to grasp. And though I know that upon first hearing about these proportional relationships and seeing this sort of stuff, it might seem that I'm laying the bullshit on pretty heavily. But this is here, underlying the picture. Your job is to start to discover these things and to find them on your own. It might not seem like an inherently important thing in the creation of an image, but these proportions have been used for thousands of years to create pleasing and balanced images. And that's what this is about. Going back to the idea of balance. Balance creates a sense of timelessness. If all of the shapes correspond with each other, in relation to each other, in relation to the overall size of the picture plane, this helps to create a sense of timelessness, which is what you want in your art, not frozen time, but timelessness. Again, I also want to stress that it may not be that Caravaggio or anyone else is using this geometry, this mathematics of art, in a conscious way, but in their time, they each studied art very seriously and saw with their own eyes these proportional relationships being repeated over and over, to the point that this becomes a matter of intuition. Maitland Graves says that surface division ratios must be used with discretion, or they can become a hindrance, a rigid straitjacket. Ratios are a means to an end, not an end in themselves. Your job is to understand ratios and proportion in a meaningful way. And in design class, that's what we're doing, but that doesn't mean that when you go to create your paintings or your drawings or your prints or whatever else you're doing, that you're going to necessarily use ratios in a strict and mathematical, methodical way. But now is the time to recognize these things and to use them purposefully for a while, so that then you can use them intuitively and not have to think about them. So the use of proportion is how contrast is created through unity with the picture plane. And that creates the balance that you want in your work. So let's look at homework. Studio problem number 9. Using narrow dark lines in a root 2 format. That's the 5x7. Create a unity of position with a variety of size. Give me 10 thumbnails and 10 variations. And I need to stress this again. 5x7 doesn't mean that all of your formats need to be 5 inches by 7 inches. They can be literally any size. When you create your practice formats, you might create first a square that is 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. But then you'll use the diagonal of that square and drop it down in the way that we've shown here in this lecture to create a new rectangle that contains the proportion of 5x7, or 1 to 1.4. So proportion and ratios are just that. They're ratios. They're not actual measurements. I've stressed in the past that when I give you a proportion to work in, that's what I want you to use. So far it's been squares, and that if you're doing square thumbnails that you need to create square final designs. Well, now is the time when proportions becomes very serious, and you need to make sure that you're creating your proportional formats correctly each time. If you have any questions, email me.